Hi, everybody. Today is Wednesday, April 16th, 2025, and our friend Colonel Jacques Baud is back with us. Welcome back, Colonel.
Thank you very much for inviting me again. Thank you.
Let's get started, Colonel, with what's going on between the United States and China. And when we talk about the two parties, and the new articles in Reuters in Irish Times shows that the United States, one of the main goals of the United States putting tariffs on China and on the European Union is just to separate Europe from China. We talked before coming up to this live. You said that the West is killing itself for the sake of killing the enemy. What's your take on what's going on in terms of the way that the United States is just pushing and trying to separate Europe from China?
Well, I think I'm not sure that the US tries to separate Europe from China, but the fact of the matter is that now the West is in a crisis, basically. And this is not a new crisis. I think the crisis started with the Ukrainian conflict, when the West at large and European Union and European countries thought that they could defeat Russia through sanctions, and they applied all these sanctions, and that generated a sense of mistrust with the rest of the world. The pressure that was exerted by the West on the rest of the world, so that they apply sanction against Russia and all that, I think this has uh, created kind of unbalance in the whole world. I mean, there were probably signs of unbalance, but that has been the marking moment when the rest of the world, as we call it in Europe, the rest of the world thought could see, in fact, that the West was ready to shoot at itself in order to destroy Russia. And they started to severe economic or trade relations with some countries that were sanctioned because they supported, or better said, because they didn't want to condemn Russia. And we had such a sanction on a couple of countries. And that has created a mistrust between the rest of the world and Europe. The problem of Europe, the West at large, with the conflict in Ukraine, you had an apparent, let's say, converging view in the West, because there is a traditional historic fear of Russia, because it's a huge country, because and so on. And that's the reason why you had these attempts to attack Russia in the 19th century, just after World War One, and all the initiatives during the start of the Cold War by France, Germany, and the US, of course, but in the UK, to destabilize the Soviet Union by promoting, because that's something that nobody talks about, but up to the early 60s, the West tried to destabilize Soviet Union by promoting insurgency in Ukraine. And in fact, they supported and they dropped nightly agents and weapons and all that in order to create this insurgency. And so there is a historic relation or mistrust between Europeans and Soviet Union in the first place, and then Russia. So in 2022, as the conflict started, you had this kind of common understanding. They had a common enemy, and everything was more or less fine in that context. Although the rest of the world could see how Europe, especially, should itself by imposing sanctions on the natural gas as an example, a source of energy, of cheap energy, and and you had attempts of the West at large, Europe in particular, because they are taken now in the middle. The US is produces natural gas, but Europe, I mean, it does produce a little bit also, but not enough for their own its own purposes. Therefore, Europe was taken as a hostage. It was taken hostage by itself, if you want, in this conflict. And they tried to pressure other countries in order to have some kind of control of the on the oil and gas price. That was the the price caps that they tried to impose on the on oil and gas. This didn't work, but that created the sense of defiance in the rest of the world towards Europe. As Trump came into in office early this year, he started to impose its sanction. I mean, Trump is has a foreign policy which is ethnocentric or US centric, if you want. And he was elected for that because the whole idea is to reshore uh, industrial capabilities and capacities within the US, even at the expense of the European Union, by the way. So, meaning that the allies for against Russia became suddenly enemies when it comes to the foreign policy of the US. And remember that already last year, even before Donald Trump, but we have also to realize that the China, the policy of the US against China is bipartisan. It's not, Trump has, let's say, a more extreme way of addressing the problem. But that was started already with Biden. Remember the 100% tax or tariffs on EVs, for instance, that he imposed last year. In any case, after Biden imposed tariffs, European did the same. And now, and of course, at that time, Europe was or thought it was part of the same club as the US. And now Donald Trump said, no, no, you're not part of the same club. There is one club, which is the United States, and you are you're the second class members. And America first, that's one thing, and then maybe you. But first, we'll even take jobs from you into United States. So suddenly, Europe finds itself caught in a fight it was not prepared for. Even if since last year we know exactly what would happen if Donald Trump would be elected, and since October we know that Donald Trump is elected, but the European Union didn't react to that, and so we have a very much unprepared European Union, which is focused, and that's very interesting when you live here in Europe. When you talk about foreign policy and all that, when everything you read in Europe regarding foreign policy is always related to Russia. It's almost as if foreign policy or diplomacy has totally disappeared, and everything is what we do is part of a security driven against Russia. But there is no foreign policy, and Europe has got caught into this kind of or trapped into this approach to the problem. Now, Europe, as you have seen in the various conflicts, we have now a couple of crises, I would say, four major crises, I would say. You have, of course, Ukraine, you have Palestine, and then you have China, which is another crisis at another level, but it's another crisis, and Iran, which is another crisis or a potential crisis. In none of those crises, you have European Union. Every time you have a problem, I mean, you want to have an agreement with Israel or with Iran or whoever, everybody looks back at the US, including in Europe. But nobody even think about having Europe being involved in that. Europe has totally focused on the conflict in Ukraine, has never been even able to solve diplomatically the problem. It's the only effect or impact of foreign policy was to provide weapons and ammunition to Ukraine, but there's no attempt to solve the problem diplomatically. And the same for other conflicts. You can talk about Palestine, Iran, and all. As we discussed before this program, when we talked about a GCPOA, for instance, that we had, that the Obama administration sponsored in 2015-16 with Iran, you had the US and Iran as partners, that's clear, but you had also European Union, and you had France, Germany, UK, and China. Now, today, there is an attempt from the Trump administration to revive some form of GCPOA. But you see, the negotiation you have are between the US and Iran through Oman and things like that. But nobody talks about the European Union. They're totally absent of the picture. And when we talk about Ukraine, we have exactly the same picture. We talk about Keith Kellogg, Steve Witkoff, Zelensky, Trump, Putin, but nobody mentioned any European. I mean, the Europeans, the only contribution is who will provide the troops in case we want to deploy peace forces. And then you have Keith Kellogg and Emmanuel Macron, who try to put on their uniform of generals to put troops. But there is absolutely no impact of the UK, British or French diplomacy in that. They are not invited. They are not a part of the talks. They are not part of the resumption of a dialogue. So we see, and I think that's something that the whole world has now witnessed. This is this essential weakness of the West and Europe in particular, that is able only to act on a very limited range of activities, namely provide weapons, but is totally unable, and not even unable, but even if it would be on the diplomatic scene, nobody would even listen to them. And that's very interesting. We could see that after you had these declaration of J.D. Vance in the Munich conference in February, and then you had this I don't know if it's sad or funny or tragic episode in the Oval Office. You had the European countries who tried to reassemble and find a common reaction to that, and find a way to solve the Ukrainian crisis. They were not even able to gather all the Europeans. In fact, when we talk today about sending troops, you have only one EU country, France, and one non-EU country, which is UK, who are ready to deploy forces. Even the Poles, who are very strong supporters of the European Union because they are net recipients of the EU aid, therefore they are very much in favor of the EU, they are not ready to provide troops to solve or to to have any kind of influence on the Ukraine conflict. So we see that European Union has not even managed to be united in this conflict. There was this tacit, I would say, tacit agreement among them at the beginning of the conflict that Russia is the country that attacked Ukraine and therefore has to be punished, sanctioned, and all that. But very soon we have seen, even within the Europeans themselves, that they realized that the policy that was applied to Russia was completely disregarding the interests of the Europeans themselves. And that's the reason why you had Fico in Slovakia and Orban in Hungary, who clearly showed their another position towards Russia. And as a response, you have more and more kind of dictatorial approach of Europe. First of all, they start sanctioning Hungary, for instance, because of its support or because it didn't want to sanction Russia. So they were sanctioned within the European Union. And now you have, because some leaders in the world have been invited to the ceremony of the 18th anniversary of the end of the World War II in Moscow. Now the European Union decided to sanction those leaders who accept the invitation of Vladimir Putin. So we are in a very strange type of situation where we start to, first of all, sanction has become the main tool of foreign policy for Europe, apparently, because they are not able to act diplomatically, so they just sanction people. And in addition to that, you don't exactly understand why this. Why are they so upset? Because the leader of a country wants to have a good relation with Russia. After all, it would be it would be probably possible start for an exit strategy, but you don't see any exit strategy in the Europe. You don't. They haven't figured out how they would get out of the conflict. They provide weapons and they declare that they want to continue supporting Ukraine, but for which goal? For which purpose? This has never been defined. What happens if what we see today on the battlefield continues? I mean, that Ukraine gets slightly but constantly and systematically destroyed. Europe will simply provide weapons. And how will it prevent Ukraine to be defeated? What is the definition of defeat for Ukraine or for Russia? What would be the meaning of a victory for Ukraine or for Russia? These kind of questions are totally absent from European thinking. And you see that Europe was able, and that's probably the reason why you had Emmanuel Macron on the 5th of March making an address to all its fellow citizens in France, saying that France must be ready for war because after Ukraine, Russia will continue its progression, meaning that, nota bene, they didn't even consider the fact that Ukraine could stop that. They said, well, after Ukraine, it will be ourselves. So they even imagined that, in fact, Ukraine is already defeated. I mean, what Macron said is if as conceding the victory of Russia. But in addition to that, he portrayed a vision of the future, which is, in fact, World War III. And we are back to what we had in 2022, where you had leaders in Europe with poor um, popular support, with relatively poor strategies. They were Emmanuel Macron was a pointed case, a case in point, where is he was contested, violently contested. We the Europe was just getting out of the COVID crisis, where none of those governments, European governments, has performed well. They they were unable to adapt or adopt um, strategies that would prevent the disease. They tried something, but they were never a real consistent approach to problems. And therefore, the conflict in Ukraine came at the right point to have some kind of gung ho effect, when you are attacked. And so now we have to all be together fighting against Russia. Russia is putting the international world order in danger, and therefore we have to react. But now, with after 3 years, people have understood that what we said was wrong. All these countries, Western leaders, promised to defeat Russia through sanctions. It didn't happen. They promised to develop economy, and that Russian economy was failing. It's exactly the opposite that happens. Europe is deindustrializing while Russia is industrializing. Um, and therefore, the trust between the population in Europe towards their leaders is fading away, and we have seen that in various elections that we had in France, in Germany, in the UK, and everywhere, where people have a lot of mistrust against their leaders. So today, I think Trump is the final nail in the coffin, if you want, because it shows that the US, good or bad, right or wrong, but that's the policy of Donald Trump, and that's the mandate on which or the program on which it was elected. It's to make America great again. But nobody has realized in Europe that making US great again is, of course, at the expense of the rest of the world. And even if Marco Rubio acknowledged that the time for unipolarity is gone, and now we are entering, or we are in a era of multipolarity. Notice that unipolarity or multipolarity is not a policy. And that's very important to understand, by the way, that multipolarity is a state of the world. So it's a fact. It's given. It's the result of the evolution, international relations, trade, and all that. It's not a policy. The policy would be exactly what we have seen recently applied by Donald Trump, for instance. In fact, it's the hegemonic behavior that is back. It takes other forms than under Biden or Obama or even other US president. It's a little bit more brutal, but it's the same policy in essence, meaning that the US has a leading role in the world to fulfill, and it is on the right path. It has democratic institutions. It has a liberal economic system. It's the system that can generate the most success, opportunities, and all that. And therefore, this is a good system, and this good system is worth being propagated and advertised and adopted by other countries as well. So We are in this situation today, that the US is applying a US centric policy, but the EU in that context is completely disarmed because it didn't prepare itself for that. So it was fine to fight against Russia, but now it is taken in between different um, current or trends. It cannot. It has not the same competition uh, issue with China. It cannot cut from the US because it's an ally, and it has not all the capacities that have other competitors. I mean, Europe has only limited resources, natural resources, energy resources. Uh, China, Russia US is more or less has also access to a lot of resources, and Europe is let alone in that, without foreign policy, without a real consistent approach to the world, we can say, without any consistent approach to how should Europe develop into something. And therefore now the losers of all this conflict, there might be other losers. I mean, again, I'm not suggesting that the policy applied by Donald Trump will be extremely successful, but that's another this is another issue. But at least that's the policy they want to apply, that they decided to apply, and okay, they take the risk. But the Europe here in between has decided nothing. They have not been deciding on the future. They have no leverage on Russia. They have almost no leverage on Ukraine. They have no leverage on the rest of the world, and they have no leverage on the US. So the geopolitical loser of this situation is Europe. And probably the positive aspect of that is probably it shows the limits of the European project. As um, at the end of the World War II, or better said, at the beginning of the Cold War, the US realized that it needed a strong Europe to face the Soviet Union. And that's the reason why the US, in fact, sponsored the European unity and the creation of the European institutions, because it wanted to have a united Europe against Soviet Union. There was a concern in the US that communism, and remember that during World War II, communists, especially in Italy and France, were instrumental in resisting against the Germans. And therefore, the communist parties in both Italy, and not just in Italy and France, by the way, you had the same thing in Germany, you had the same thing in other countries in Europe, where the Communist Party had a lot of support because it was part of the winners. And that's the reason why the US started to be involved in the creation of the European Union. But the European Union we have now is not exactly the one that was designed by the US, even if some Americans at that time had this idea of the United States of Europe, which is something that still some Europeans have in mind, by the way, but I don't think it can take ground because Europeans are too diverse. But the Europe that was created by the US was a trade union, basically, what we used to call the common market, of which you had, I mean, all the big countries of Western Europe today: France, Germany, Italy, UK, Belgium, Netherlands, and all that, Luxembourg. This was the core of the this trade market, the trade European market. And later, the Europeans had this idea of coming into one state and starting to have a common foreign policy, a common security policy, and that started to go wrong because the French have or had their own foreign policy towards Africa, especially because they were traditionally related to Africa. Spain had these ties with Latin America, the same with Portugal and Brazil, for instance. You had and other countries that we see today, even, I mean, Estonia, for instance, has as a focus Russia. I mean, that's everything the Estonians do is related to Russia. Period. Nothing else. So how do you accommodate these diverse concerns that you have in Europe together into one foreign policy? It's almost impossible. And I think European Union made a mistake by having Kaya Kallas as the foreign minister. I mean, it's not technically it's not a foreign minister, but it's the leader of the European External Action Service, which is some kind of foreign ministry of the European Union. In any case, she's in charge of shaping the foreign policy of the European Union. But look at this. She comes from one of the smallest countries in the European Union, which is Estonia. She used to be prime minister of Estonia. Estonia has 1.5 million inhabitants. By the way, a decreasing population because people are flying away of Estonia. This country is a country that is, in fact, net recipient of economic aid from the European Union. If you look at the map of the European Union, if you look those who are the donors and those who are receiving aid from the European Union, you will see that, in fact, the whole eastern part of Europe is a net recipient of EU aid. That's the reason why those countries are so vehemently in favor of Europe, by the way, because they receive aid. I mean, these countries are not even able to have a sustainable economic systemic life
System. Yeah.
or system. They live based on European aid, which is paid by the western part of Europe. That's very sad. So meaning that you have Estonia, this very tiny country, Kaya Kallas coming from this country, with a focus exclusively on Russia. And just to show the mood in Estonia, just last week, the parliament adopted a law in Estonia that prevents the Russians, I would not even say citizens because they are non-citizens, because they have special rules for ethnic Russians in Estonia. But now they adopted a law that prevents those Russians to vote in local elections in the country. So this is a country that is talking about values, democratic values, and all that. But in fact, within this country, you have a divide, a legal divide, based not on what people do, but based on what they are. And we are exactly back I mean, this is not surprising because Estonia has a history of support of the Germany of the 30s. But this is reminiscent of the laws that you had in 1935 in Germany, the so-called Nuremberg laws, that granted rights to the population not based on what they do, but on what they are. In 1935, the Germans were obviously targeting the Jewish population. But it shows that you have countries, even today, even 80 years after World War II, you still have countries that have a legal system that is based on ethnicity in Europe, and not based on what these population are doing, but on what they are. So, and now the external or the foreign policy of the EU should be shaped or defined or led by this person who has her view exclusively on Russia. How can she address the concerns of, let's say, the Spanish, the Greeks, or the Italians, whose problems are mostly illegal immigration from Africa, for instance? Because that's the main concern they have, and of course there are many different type of issues related to the Mediterranean area. So you see, and that illustrates the the problem that you have in the EU, trying to accommodate objectives, vision, even vision of the world, what you say in German under the word of Weltanschauung. This is the perception of the world, uh, essentially, that are fundamentally different. And when you see, when we talk about Ukraine and all that, you see the Portuguese are not very interested about what's happening in Ukraine. They are not concerned. And even the Hungarians have a different view on Ukraine. And why? Because you have Hungarian minorities in Ukraine who are suffering under Zelensky's rule there. And therefore, you have, even if they're very close, and probably the closest to Ukraine, they have a different view from Brussels because they know what Ukraine is about when it comes to their own minorities. So we see within Europe this this differences among countries that are now coming to the surface, and that explains also why you have the rhetoric that amplifies in Europe of a possible war in Europe. Because again, we are back to the same dynamics that we had in 2022. At least we had a real enemy to be that would gather all Europeans together, and in fact, Europe is in search of an enemy. Now we have to say that Trump has provided another enemy in another area, and we see that in Europe the perception of Donald Trump is extremely negative. It was negative during his first mandate, and now it's even more because obviously European Union it will be affected by these tariffs. So the problem here is that Europe has not been able to define its own path. It is subject to what happens, what others have decided, what Trump decided, what Putin decided, what Xi Jinping decides, what Netanyahu decides, and so on. But they are not
You
able.
mean a reactionary policy, not
Exactly.
a.
Well, I mean, it's not even reactionary because they are not able to react, but they are subject to that. They are subject to decision of others, and not even being able to react on that because they don't know how to react. You see, when it comes to China, which was your question at the beginning, a lot of people in Europe think that we should not antagonize China because, as it is for the US, it is our main economic partner, and it's probably better to be in good terms with China than antagonizing because, especially with the trend of deindustrialization that we have now in Europe, it's probably not the best moment to antagonize China. But a lot of people, and you can listen to what Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, said. He he tends to adopt the enemy of the US, you see? And you have a lot of people saying the same thing because China is not democratic, China is a dictatorship, blah, 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 and they help Russia for his war, and so on and so forth. And therefore, you even there, you don't have a real, let's say, common understanding of the situation. You have those who make they would prioritize human rights and things like this. Other would prioritize economic objectives and things like this. So you don't have a common vision of all that. And the interesting thing in all that is that regardless of what you may think about China, Russia, US, and so on, the main concern of the European leaders should be their own interests. What is our interest? And nobody does this. I mean, with the exception of people like Fico and Orban, who repeatedly said, "Well, I'm fighting for the national interests of Hungarian or Slovaks and so on." So they are consistent with the mandate they received from their own people, and they work in order to fulfill or, to satisfy the national interest of their own population. But when you hear Annalena Baerbock, for instance, when she was questioned about the role in Ukraine and all that, she said, "I don't care about what the Germans want. I have values and I decide that it must be like this. But whether or not it affects the interests of the Germans, this is irrelevant to me."
By the way, the new chancellor of Germany is the same.
Yes, absolutely, exactly. Yes, but Baerbock said it explicitly, and that was very interesting because she used to be the foreign minister, and therefore you could expect that she would defend the interest of the German population in developing international relation and addressing other countries. But no, she just worked towards fulfilling her own objectives, not the objectives of the population. Well, that's probably the reason why you have this a spectacular increase of influence and interest for the AfD in Germany. That's the right wing party, because precisely they feel abandoned by their own government. And Merz is essentially the same, but I'm not aware he said it so explicitly as Annalena Baerbock. That's the reason why I quoted her. So we have this problem in Europe that we don't know exactly for which interest we are working. You have discordant voices. I mean, like Macron, who says something one day and another thing the other day and things like that, because he's trying to balance the interest of France and the interest of the European Union. And it may not be the same, because obviously this is logic that European Union because it's a supranational institution, it has other view, another Weltanschauung, another understanding of the world than France, which has traditional interest zones, and, and area of interest. So uh, that's the problem, and you see that in France, for instance, now the foreign ministry, by the way, is the foreign ministry not just of France but also for the European Union. So it's also a minister that takes the credit of the European Union. When you see Emmanuel Macron or French ministers addressing the people, you always have the European Union flag with that. And in some institutions, and most institutions, I think, ministers, you always have the flag of the European Union in France. Meaning that basically they have to balance between the interests of European Union and the interest of France, which might be contradictory in some point. And that's exactly what we are seeing today in France. So that's one of the explanations for what you are, for the for this kind of let's say erratic approach to foreign policy that you have in Europe at large and in countries such as France or Germany. So that's a little bit the problem. Now the issue of tariffs, we have now a pause on tariffs, but the problem here that we see, and that's also the same issue we have addressed when talking about Ukraine. We know since last year, since Donald Trump entered in the presidential race last year, that if he would be elected, and there were good chances he would, that he would try to negotiate the end of the conflict in Ukraine, and that he would apply tariffs on everyone to, to reshore the industry in the US. So everything was on the table. Since last November, we know that this will come because Donald Trump has been extremely consistent in everything he's promised or said, and he said that. So we knew since November, it's almost 6 months now, that this policy would be implemented in some form. But still, you have absolutely no plan at European level to, let's say, to cope with the situation, to find, to bypass these tariffs, to find alternative solutions, to have another, let's say, a reaction plan, and all that. You have nothing. So when coming back to your question, they're not even able to react because they don't know how to react. And we have exactly the same thing about Palestine. We have discussed that several times. Everybody understands that Israel is not abiding by the international humanitarian law or the law of war. Everybody knows that. This is, I think, unchallenged. But still, we are unable to apply a policy. I can understand to some extent, the US, because somehow they are connected to Israel, and okay, personally, I would say they could react differently, but let's assume let's assume they can't and they cannot do otherwise. But it's not the case of the Europeans. They are not they are not involved in this conflict in any way. And that's exactly the same situation we have discussed many times about Ukraine. US has been promoting this conflict, has been behind the conflict in Ukraine, has been helping actively Ukrainians. through intelligence and all that. We have seen this article of the New York Times recently that just confirms things that we knew before. In any case, there is a direct involvement of the US since 2014. Okay, that's a foreign policy of the US. Again, I think it's a wrong policy, but that's their policy. The problem is, if you look at it from the European point of view, it's not our policy. We have nothing to do with that. So, why should we accept something we haven't decided at all? We are not really involved in it. Well, now the European has in fact decided to be involved by providing weapons and support and things like this, but it was not obliged to. Europe could have been instrumental in pressuring Zelensky to implement the agreement, the Minsk agreement, for instance. It never did that. So the Europeans we see are not able to have an independent foreign policy. They are outsiders everywhere. They are never involved in any type of diplomatic initiative or negotiation or all that. So they're completely outsiders. And their only way of trying to influence events is by putting oil on fire. And that's extremely strange. Again, this is something I I was definitely against the U.S. intervention in Iraq in 2003, but that was their policy. That they decided and they did and they lied for that, and okay, that's consistent. There is a consistent approach with their policy. We can criticize the policy, definitely I do, but at least there's a consistency. We have the same problem there. Why then would European countries go along with the US? There was absolutely no reason for that. None, zero. But they still got along with the US, with the exception of the French, who resisted under Jacques Chirac, who said, no, we are not going to support you in this adventure. And you remember this fantastic speech of Dominique de Villepin, the French foreign minister in the Security Council, just weeks before the US intervention in Iraq. But by the way, since then, in 2014, the French joined the US in Iraq. By the way, that's triggered the terrorism that came in France in 2015 and 2016 and 17. But what I mean is that we have in Europe, we lack people who know what they want. In fact, I think the prototype of such politician or leader is probably the Finnish prime minister. It was this young lady, Marin, I don't remember the name, by the way, and she was caught in some kind of a scandal involving powder and things like this. In any case, she was not re-elected and she had to leave. But what is interesting is that after she left her position as Prime Minister of Finland, she was interviewed in a Finnish magazine, and they asked her, why did you engage into politics and as a prime minister? She was one of the youngest prime minister of Finland, by the way. She was in the early 30s or something like that, so extremely young. And she said, well, I was just looking for an experience. That's it. Leading a country was for her just having an experience. She could have sold ice creams in Italy or things like that. It's also an experience. I mean, prime minister, there is no And we have no longer these politicians who are willing to take care of the interest of their population, who take care of the national interest of their population, who are ready to confront even European Union and all that, um, in order to make the interest of the population a priority. And now we have young people who are just seeking an experience. And if you look at the nature of the ministers that you have in Europe, in a European level, I mean, in France, but also to some extent in Germany, you have young people with no experience, no real experience, no life experience, who are not even elected, because at the end of the day, many ministers, typically in France, they don't need to be elected. They are nominated by the prime minister. But even the prime minister doesn't need to be elected. Only the president is elected. Uh, so these ministers who are not elected but just selected by some, uh, they take decisions that are not based on a solid life experience, a solid professional experience, a solid world wide experience. They haven't traveled, they haven't lived in other countries. They don't know the world. They don't even know their own countries, because very usually these are people who have studied and they were probably brilliant at school, but that's the world they know. It's schools, high schools, academies, and things like that's all. They don't know who lives outside of these institutions, and suddenly they are parachuted as a minister somewhere, and they take decisions that are totally disconnected from reality. And that's, I think, this is the tragic situation that we have in Europe at large. And if you look at the profile of the people we have in the rest of the world, you have people who are much older, with much more experience, but who take decisions that are based on thinking, based on discussion with others. And look at the difference between Annalena Baerbock as an example for a foreign minister and Sergei Lavrov as an example, or Wang Yi, the Chinese. This is a world of difference. You have, on the one hand, young people, ambitious, who are just eager to be treated as minister, arrogant, want to impose their view on others. And on the other hand, you have those people who have experienced different worlds, so to say, because Sergei Lavrov has also experienced the communist world at that time, the Cold War, the relations, a time in which we had a Cold War, but we were still talking to each other. Very important to remind people of that. And today we are in this world of, I mean, they know this world of dialogue, and that's they developed with Iran, with China, with the BRICS and all that. And that's this world that is taking precedence today. This is the world, this alternative or rest of the world, if you want, that gets importance. Everybody talks about this, the collapse of the West, failing strategies. Today, most of the patents in the world are made, made in China, for instance. So China is no longer this country that produce cheap stuff based on cheap labor. They are innovative, they are creative, they develop new technologies that we are not even able to develop in our countries. They find innovative solutions at home, not just in terms of technical and technological engineering, but also in social engineering. Um, so we have here, and I think what Trump has made apparent here, I mean, what in essence the Ukrainian conflict has made apparent, and Trump is now just underlining that, is the fact that the rest of the world today is the future, and what we have in the West, unless we realize that, we start to restructure, rethink ourselves, rethink our approach to the world, rethink our approach to international relations, start to have international relations based on sanctions, war, and oppression. Um, what we have seen, when we talk about Greenland, when we talk about Panama and all that, what do we have? This kind of gunboat policy of the US, that when you don't agree with me, I will come with my boat and I will gun you until you accept. You see, this is exactly that. By the way, this is slowly, I mean, hopefully it will not go to that point. But this is a little bit what we are hearing from Donald Trump, since he's not achieving the success he expected in Ukraine. And now he's threatening everybody with sanctions. So we sanctions, force or use of force, have become the base of the foreign policy today. And that's typical from the West, because the rest of the world doesn't do like this. I mean, we had last year this these discussions between India and China to resolve their border disputes. We have that on several crises. We could see the result of the rest of the world diplomacy when you saw Iran and Saudi Arabia shaking hands, and having Iran reintegrated in the Conference of Islamic State, and so on. So we see that what is effective is not threatening people with sanctions. It's dialogue. It's trying to understand the other, not trying to impose what we think are our values. By the way, what are our values? When we see that Israel is bombing civilians, everybody knows that. UN has explained and condemned that, but not a single European country says. So where are our values? We practice torture, we practice extortion, we steal resources of others. What are the values, basically? Where are they? What are they? We talk about those values, we talk about them, but we never define them, because we could probably, it would be very hard to define them exactly. Even when we talk about democracy, I've said many times, I come from a country, Switzerland, which has its own view on democracy. But when I see France, for instance, and when I see that French pretend being a democratic country, seeing with my Swiss eyes, this is just another type of dictatorship. Same as if I look at the European Union. When you start to sanction people because they want to go to Moscow, I mean, what's that? When you prevent people from traveling, I mean, that's exactly what we condemned with the Soviet Union 40 years ago. And we are doing exactly the same. We ban we ban the media we don't like. We ban the media in China, the Chinese, Russian media in Europe. And okay, you could see probably the Russians do the same. But after all, we are the ones who pretend to have values. Our value is democracy. Democracy is accepting all the views, understanding and accepting all the different point of views. This is democracy. Even those who are against democracy should have a place in democracy. That's the paradox. When you start banning people from the democratic dialogue, that means that you are not secure. That means that you don't trust your own democratic value. Otherwise, what would be the problem? I mean, during the Cold War, I have said that many times. We could buy the Pravda, Literaturная Gazeta. You could buy these papers, Soviet papers, Communist Party papers, in almost every paper outlet in the West, because we were confident that we were on the right path. So we were not afraid having the Soviets making propaganda in Europe, because we were confident that our system was better. Therefore, why should be afraid of something we know is inferior or not as effective or things like that? Maybe a lot of communists today could probably object. That is another. But what I mean, you understand what I mean, is that if you are confident in your system, then you can accept the view of others because you're confident that what you think is the right thing. When you start doubting of that, then you have to ban others to talk, because obviously you don't want to create additional challenge to something you think and it's already challenged by nature.
I don't know if you have watched the Emmanuel Macron, this video that he's just feeling that he's Napoleon. Here is the video call. You look at him, you feel like you're watching Zelensky. This is an actor. He's not a. You've mentioned Jacques Chirac. I remember him and the way that he was leading France. He was a real leader, in my opinion. He wanted something for France. He wanted to achieve something. But you see the new leaders, Kaya Kallas, you mentioned, the new Chancellor of Germany, Macron, Olaf Scholz. There is no. I would separate the United Kingdom from the other countries because they feel much more connected with the United States. I don't know what is the agenda on their part, but you in the other countries in Europe, I'm not talking about the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and go ahead, and all the Western Europeans, and you don't see a leader, you don't see an option on the table to people to vote for. This is it's not just about Kaya Kallas. It's a somehow it's I don't know who's supporting them. What is this establishment, the same establishment in the United States that's running the show in Europe? Because if you change Olaf Scholz and getting Merz, and this is even worse than Olaf Scholz. Nothing is changing, you're just worsening.
Well, of course, if you talk about Germany, you have institutional setting that explain the way the system works, and that explains the reason why you have some kind of continuity there. This is this. You have to remember that France is an exception in that, because the system in France is probably closer to the one you have in the US. But Germany typically is a coalition type of government, and therefore it's built for continuity somehow. It's not a system that is built for sharp changes. And that's probably the result of the experience of World War II. I am not a very strong um, expert in German politics and the history of the politics, but I would assume that the experience of World War II or pre World War II explains a little bit this idea of having coalition systems. If you look at Switzerland, for instance, you also have a coalition system, which is extremely stable and provide a very stable decision making as well. You cannot have sharp changes in Switzerland, because in the government you will have automatically two socialists, two right wing or mid right wing, and so on and so forth. So the combination is more or less given. It's not given by law, but it's given by practice, and people don't want to change this, what we used to call the magic formula. And therefore you have this a system that provides continuity. The problem is that we have in our societies people who can suddenly emerge from nothing and being considered as leaders simply because they have a lot of there is a lot of marketing behind them. That was exactly what happened to Emmanuel Macron before he was first elected in 2016 17. There was a huge effort of marketing because he was, I mean, because I don't know the reason. We assume the reason is that he was the guy of the finance system. He was very much related to the Rothschild Bank and things like that, and therefore that probably explains why you had kind of a oligarchy who wanted to have this guy in that position, although he officially said that he was socialist, but he has obviously no socialist. I'm not sure he knows exactly what socialism is, in fact. That's probably just a way of seeing something. And so it's a multifaceted person. He says something, but is something else. So he pleases everybody. He pleases those who are happy with the picture, and he pleases those who are happy with the content. It's a little bit that, if you want. But the reality is that we have in Europe people who are not, let's say, professional I mean, not it's not a question of professional or not. It's not it. These are people who have been promoted to that to the position they have through this marketing, rather than people who have emerged after years through, uh, let's say, through their achievements. I mean, if you look at François Mitterrand, for instance, who was a socialist president, and we can agree or not with him. This is a guy who had extensively changed his views. I mean, he was in the he was very young during World War II, where he was part of the government that was that was in favor of the Germans. Then he changed side. He became part of the resistance. Then he became and these guys have changed side many times. They are extremely pragmatic, opportunistic, even. But at the same time, these were people with a huge amount of experience. And when he became president in 1981, again, we can agree or not with his policy and his ideas, but the fact of the matter is that he had a very strong experience of political life, having been through different conflicts in different positions, in different parties, going from right to left. But these were people who had at least an experience. When you say Emmanuel Macron, for instance, Nobody knew him before he was elected president. I mean, he was an obscure, he has been selected as minister by someone, but he had no previous political life. He had no achievements. Nobody can say he has done this, he has taken part to this, he has such experience. I talked about the Finnish prime minister, Kaja Kallas, same thing. All these people, they are people without previous experience. So people, they are selected because probably, and here we have also to be honest, because the voters don't care anymore. You had probably 30, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, you had very prominent political figures, characters, personalities, and they were people with charisma somehow, and people selected them because they achieved something, they have done something, they knew them. Today, it's very easy to be known just through Twitter and all that. You see, that you don't need to have achieved a lot, and that probably explained that the voters are not demanding enough. They don't really care, and they know that when a president is elected in France, typically, of course, there are a lot of promises, but I mean, they make promises because they don't fulfill them. So you can promise everything because at the end, it's no problem. You will not fulfill them, and nobody fulfill, and there is no accountability for that. And therefore, my feeling is that because also the institutions don't allow for the people to say to someone, no, that's that's the wrong way. You promised this, you have to fulfill that, because that's the reason why we elected you. And since you don't have the institutional process that allows to dismiss someone, for instance, then of course, yeah, the name of the game is just being elected. Once you're elected, you can do whatever you want. You don't care, and people don't care either. If you go into Switzerland, where we decide for everything, we decide for every law. We even decided to keep the Swiss army, because at one point it was asked whether or not we should disband. At the end of the Cold War, it was the people was asked whether or not we should keep the army, because there was no Cold War, so no threat, and therefore we could disband the army. Well, the people decided to keep the Swiss army, and that's the reason why we still have a Swiss army. But what I mean with that is that in Switzerland, we decide for everything. We decide on our own taxes. We decided on what we spend our money, a new fighter, a new tanks, a new. That's the people who decide that. That has drawbacks. It has its advantages. The advantage is that there is some kind of accountability of the government, because if he wants to do something and the people doesn't want, it has institutional means to tell the government, no, we don't want that. And that's a guarantee of democracy. And that explains a little bit why Switzerland goes a little bit better than than France. But in most countries, you don't have those institutional tools to to demand accountability, and therefore people don't demand it. And I think the people is also to be blamed on this way to address. There is no interest for public life. We see that more or less and less, depending on how you see it. But for instance, in Switzerland, I see that the same in Belgium, for instance, that people, political parties, have a lot of problems recruiting new people, because nobody has interest to find to engage into political life because they don't see the interest. There is no real interest for public life. So, and that goes along with this way of life that if you look around when you go on the street, everybody is just looking, it's not looking at others, not smiling at others, not talking to others. They just speak or look at their phone, their smartphone. That's the way it is. We are self-centered, and we are no longer interested about others. And that's a massive change from the society I knew when I was young as the one I have now. And of course, I have other uh, points of reference and other views on how political life should be conducted. But that's probably everybody on my age has almost the same reaction, regardless of what are the political views. But so we have a societal problem here, and this idea that because you have no interest for the national life, then you tend to say, oh, we give that to Europe, and Europe has to take care of that. And this is something we see in in Europe very strongly, that there is kind of we tend to delegate problem to the Europe, with the problem then that we have mentioned before, that Europe acts in a way that is not tailored for individual countries, but just based on another assumption of the how the world should run or be run. So that's a little bit the situation we have, and I think this is a little bit sad. But at the end, we receive what we asked for, and we are, if we are not demanding enough, we'll receive what we. And I think it's a pessimistic view, because I think we will have to have a severe crisis in order to realize the need of having competent leaders. And probably we are heading towards this. I don't know. Again, I don't have a crystal ball. I hope it's not now. It will be after me.
Hopefully not.
But we are heading towards this, and we will have big changes. We'll need to have those big changes, and probably some. That's why somehow, even if I'm not sure the trade war launched by Donald Trump is extremely wise, but probably we need such impulse, such inputs to provoke change and make us think about what what can we do better. And I think that what we have seen, especially in the wake of the European Ukraine crisis, with this gradual collapse of a European industry. And I'm not hoping, I mean, I'm sorry for all the victims of that collapse. But at the same time, we need probably something that makes us realize that we are on the wrong path. And probably this is a shock therapy somehow that Europe needs in order to realize that we're on the wrong path. So somehow, I think the problem here is Ukraine will pay the price for this, and that's extremely sad. But at the same time, that's probably the price to have people thinking a little bit deeper about what our policies, the lack of foreign policies, the art of diplomacy that we have lost. And if I don't want to be too pessimistic and have a touch of optimism in that, I would say if we all these collapse and catastrophes and disasters that we have created can help us or show us a better way of dealing with problems, then probably it's worth it. I don't know. Again, this is probably almost a philosophical question, but again, I think the discrepancy that we see today in Europe between the European population and its leaders is is fantastic. I've never seen that before. Uh, Leaders are hated. You mentioned Macron. I don't know who likes Macron. He's become the president by default.
I know who likes it's
Sorry?
Zelensky is in Ukraine.
Well, probably. But you were talking about an actor. Remember, I mean, Zelensky was an actor, that's very clear. But the wife, again, we don't know if it's a wife, but the wife of Emmanuel Macron used to be her art teacher. So she taught him acting. So he is an actor, and he plays that. And probably this was during the first mandate when he was in his first presidency. Emmanuel Macron used to visit the military units, of course. And he he used to put the uniform of the, so when he went in submarine, he had the uniform of a submariner, and when he went to visit the Air Force, he had the fly suit of the this is like a small kid who wants to play with I want the tools of the soldiers. I want the gun. I want this a little bit like a child somehow. And today he plays this role. And when you mention Napoleon, it says, I it's interesting that you mentioned Napoleon with the sequence you showed, because we have those picture of Napoleon reviewing the troops with the color of the coat, which is up like this. You see this? It's exactly. It just the hat is just missing. This is the only thing that is missing here, but he has exactly the same attitude. And somehow it's a posture. That's something that you have when it talks about engaging troops in Ukraine and all that. You see that it has no depth. There is no thinking behind this. There is no real strategy behind it. He just wants to do something to show that he does things. And again, we are back to the same problem. The problem here is not so much that he says so and he acts so, but the problem is that nobody tells him so. Nobody tells him, well, but guy, you're completely beneath the problem. I mean, this is not the issue. Nobody tells him that. And therefore, he feels comfortable acting and doing that. And well, the French will pay the price for this also, but that's their problem.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Colonel, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.